we have 3 women POVs in addition to the Wildfire. And these 3 women have been through a similar trauma from different perspectives, but they've all experienced the same thing. And they react in very different ways. There's a lot of toxicity that bubbles to the surface. So I knew the Wildfire would be a backdrop and an important part. But as I was writing, I realized it was kind of more than that. It was kind of a character in a way that my other settings haven't been as much.
This week I got to talk with Heather Chavez about her newest thriller, What Will Burn Last. I flew through this book. It is so pacey. There's something happening every single chapter, and I could not wait to figure out what happened. So here's the synopsis. When she was 12, Leyna Clarke watched her older sister Grace walk away from their Sierra Nevada foothills home with her boyfriend Adam Duran. Neither was ever seen again. 16 years later, a stranger who looks like Grace shows up at the restaurant where Leyna works and vanishes soon after. When it comes out that Leyna was one of the last people to have talked with the young woman, Leyna's childhood crush Dominic, who is also Adam's brother, pleads with her to do the last thing she wants, to come home. But Leyna isn't the only one who hasn't been able to leave that fateful night behind. Her mother, Meredith, still lives in the family's old home, even if she claims to believe the police's theory that Grace and Adam were willing runaways. Down the street, Adam and Dominic's mother, Olivia, has also stayed, determined to be there when her son finally returns, and to prove that Meredith and Leyna have been hiding something all these years. But the past isn't the only threat to the 2 families or the missing girl. As a wildfire sparks, tempers flare, and intentions turn deadly, because someone in the neighborhood knows what really happened that night and just how good the forest is at keeping its secrets. This one was really fun because all the POVs are kind of at war with each other. They all feel like the other POVs have something to hide, or that they were a part of something, or they have some grudge against them. So reading it is crazy because you're trying to figure out whose POV you even trust and what really happened that night 16 years ago. I could not put this book down. I was burning through it, pun intended, and it was just truly a very fast-paced, fun ride. That being said, let's hear from Heather about it. So before we dive into What Will Burn, I did want to get to know a little bit about you first. So when did you know you wanted to be an author, or when were you like, I want to write a book?
I always knew I wanted to write from the time I was very young. I just didn't know what I wanted to write. I wrote a lot of poetry, novellas when I was in middle school. And it was when I read my first Dean Koontz book that I was like, okay, I want to do this. I want to write books that make people squirm and uncomfortable, and you know, their heart, you know, beat faster. And so I always knew I wanted to write, but I started with very, you know, innocuous poetry, nothing dark at all. I think the first thing I got published was a poem in a regional magazine in Kansas where my grandma lived, that was about socks finding their pair. I mean, it was just like this. I got $3 or something like that. It was so, yeah, definitely an evolution through the years.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so cool, that you just knew from so early on. As you started writing novels, what is your writing process like? So do you mostly know where the story's going, or do you kind of pants it?
It's evolved as well. I mean, I wrote 3 practice books, what I call practice books, before I wrote No Bad Deed. And it was finding my process. Because one thing I didn't expect, I'm writing my 5th book now, and one thing I didn't expect is I expected once I had it dialed in, it would work for me every time. And that's not necessarily the case. Yes. I started out firmly a pantser. Yeah. I started on page 1 with an idea, and then I just started writing. And then when it got to the, quote, editing phase, it was really rewriting the whole book because that's just what I was doing. And it was not very good. and then finally I found my process in No Bad Deed. And I think that's part of why I finally decided, hey, yeah, I'm going to query this one, because I realized how much I needed an outline, but it was very bare bones. I mean, it was a very bare bones. Now, my outlines have grown a lot.
Yeah.
But then I've also opened myself up to the discovery, more than I did in the beginning when I started outlining, because I've realized that all the most exciting parts for me tend to be stuff I stumble upon. I have the most
Yeah.
inconvenient epiphanies. And so I have an outline, but I do take frequent detours.
Yeah. That works. I've heard some people talk about that where like if they can surprise themselves, they feel like then they can surprise the reader too. So it sounds like it's kind of similar to that.
Yes. And I feel like also when I'm beginning, I do a pre-work. If I do Enneagrams for my characters, I just kind of think of how they would answer certain questions and what they would think, because like in Before She Finds Me, for example, Julia and Ren have some similarities, but they're very different
Mm-hmm.
people and they would handle the situation in very different ways. And it's the same for What Will Burn Last, as far as we have three women POVs, in addition to the wildfire. And these three women have been through a similar trauma, from different perspectives, but they've all experienced the same thing. And they react in very different ways. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of toxicity that bubbles to the surface. And
Yeah.
so that is something I think about as I'm writing, because really, until I really know the characters and I've written them, I can't really firmly decide how they'll react. And that's usually what changes.
Yeah.
Like all of a
Yeah.
sudden I'm like, oh, that's not the antagonist. This person's
Mm.
the antagonist. And all the things that just kind of come to the surface at the most inconvenient moments.
Yeah. That is so cool that you use the Enneagram. I follow so many Enneagram accounts. And I think it's cool. Like what I like about that personality assessment or whatever we want to call it is it also comes from the person's like biggest fear kind of, or
Yes.
like what they're trying to avoid. So like that makes a lot of sense that it would help to know that going into writing the characters.
Oh, definitely. Leyna's a 5, by the way, the investigator. And
Yes.
and I honestly am surprised, because I did Enneagrams and I don't have them memorized for all the characters. I should know, but since I've moved on, to plotting the next thing,
Yes.
um, I've forgotten what they are.
Yeah.
But I do remember Leyna was a 5. And it's funny because I will answer the questions as I think they will, would react, the characters. And I do it for all the characters, not just the POVs. I do it for anybody who's on page for more than, say, 3 chapters. If they're
Yeah.
on page, then I'll do it. And I'm always amazed. I have not gotten the same Enneagram type for a book. I've gotten them over certain
Mhm.
books. But I haven't gotten the same Enneagram for a character within the same universe before.
Yeah.
So, that's, that helps too. Like, yeah, finding
Yeah.
out how they're different. It helps me figure out how they would, like, what their flaw is, what it is they believe to be true, and how
Hmm.
that influences what they actually are doing, to
Yeah, it
fix it.
probably I'm sure it helps, like especially like you're saying, like with dialogue, to know how they
Mhm.
really would respond to someone. And the other thing I was going to touch on is your POVs. Like you were saying, we have Leyna and Meredith and Olivia, and they feel so distinct. Like you can tell whose mind you're in when you're really in the chapters. So I'm sure that like it helps keep them kind of distinct too, where you're like, okay, how would this person really be interacting with this other character, which was what I really loved about this book. Was all of the POVs essentially, like you're saying, they're all related. They all had this same trauma happen where Meredith, her daughter, disappeared with Olivia's son, Adam, and then Leyna is the sister of the missing girl, Grace. And all of them kind of like have grudges against each other, or like think the other person is involved in a certain way. And so the tension was so high having it be from these three POVs, because as the reader, you can't really tell who's telling the truth or whose perspective is skewed because of different ways. So with this one, how did you know from the beginning that you wanted to have these multiple POVs to tell this story, or did you kind of figure that out as you were writing it?
I knew from the beginning that I wanted three POVs, and I wanted them to be three women. One of the things that inspired me, it has nothing to do with the book, but as far as the storytelling, when I was watching Peaky Blinders, when I was in the early stages of figuring out what this book would be, I always thought like, well, they have some very strong female characters, but it really is a story about the men, the Peaky, and their relationships. And it's a fantastic series. I love that series. But I thought, what if it had been told from the female point of view? What if the men were in the background? And so I really liked that idea. It's not at all that kind of book, but that was the catalyst for deciding I wanted three POVs. Plus I really enjoyed exploring Julia and Ren in Before She Finds Me. So I wanted to go like one more. No, and part of the reason for it was I wanted to also show the different sides of motherhood, because Meredith, Leyna's mom, is not what I would call a caretaker. And Olivia's more the baking chocolate chip pancakes with her kids kind of mom. And so I wanted to show that not every parent parents the same too. So that was one thing I wanted to explore in this, and what it's like for someone like Leyna to be in the middle of that. She used to be very close to Olivia. That was her Aunt Olivia. This is all stuff I don't know. Did you get it in the book? Because it was in my head, and maybe, you scratched the surface, but that was her safe place growing up, is that she really spent a lot of time when she was younger at Olivia's house. And so she was almost like a surrogate mom. So to have that cut off in just a moment felt very raw for her. And so originally Olivia wasn't going to be a point of view. And then as I was just going to be Meredith and Leyna. And then I thought, but how much I wanted to juxtapose the two maternal styles, if you will, as well as Leyna being in the middle of this very toxic former friendship, now enemies. And when Leyna comes home, for instance, Meredith, her mom, is on the doorstep with a bag of dog feces, planning to go put it on Olivia's doorstep. Yes. So, it's not a healthy environment, which is why Leyna hasn't been back for years. But I really wanted to see all points of view for this neighborhood feud, if you will, and different reactions to the tragedy.
Yeah. No, it did come across, because I felt the same way. Like there's something in Olivia's perspective where she talks about how she even kind of felt that that Leyna wasn't necessarily getting like maternal attention at home. I can't remember exactly what the sentence was, but it makes it more sad. Like you feel more for Leyna. Like she's so stuck between all of it. And it raised the tension a lot for me, at least.
That's a really good word, by the way. The really good perspective, the word stuck, because that is Leyna. She is stuck, and she's stuck in all the ways. So good choice of words. I'm going to use it. I'm writing it down right now.
Nice. I'm so glad. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it would just be terrible. Like someone, like you're saying, like she was her Aunt Olivia. It would just be terrible feeling like this was like someone that you got a lot of comfort from and then losing it because of something that happens like this. And without getting into spoilers, I feel like there's so much observed about like mother and child relationships, even though Meredith isn't like your traditional huggy maternal type mom, but it extends into the ending too, kind of like just there are still different ways that you can be a mom, I guess is what I'll leave it at. Will be cryptic. But the other point of view that I wasn't necessarily including it, but it is a POV, is the wildfire. Or actually, when I was talking to Ashley Winstead about it, she was even saying like it's the perspective of the trees, kind of, which was so unique. What made you kind of want to include that? Like, I felt like it made it more cinematic, but where did that idea come from?
I was actually originally writing the three women, and it was dual reasons. One was I knew I wanted to have this sense of isolation, and I knew I wanted there to be a wildfire. I wanted it, originally it was supposed to be set on an island. And then, yeah, I mean, it was a different book. It, you know, books change, outlines change. And I realized, the forest, Plumas County, that's really what I wanted, where I wanted to set it. So I knew the wildfire would be a backdrop and an important part. But as I was writing, I realized it was kind of more than that. It was kind of a character in a way that my other settings haven't been as much. I mean, settings should always, in my opinion, be somewhat of a character. Like, it's, why is it set here? That should matter. But at the same time, this one matters most because all of a sudden, there's a wildfire. But then also, from the nature of a wildfire, it's a threat, but totally without malice. So it's kind of an antagonist, but kind of just doing its thing, and having, if you've read the author's note, my own experiences evacuating during wildfire, having people that I cared about lose their homes. It's a lot to go through. And I didn't want it just to be like checking a box here. I wanted to really explore it more deeply. And I felt like the only way to do that was to give it its own chapters. So that was how it started. But then as I was writing it, I also realized it increased the sense of dread because, at first there's a dry lightning storm, the fire sparks. And, they don't realize this. They realize it's fire weather. They realize it's red flag warning, but that's just something anyone lives with here, and in other areas. It's part of living life in Northern California and other areas prone to wildfire. So it starts out this sense of uneasiness, but they're not really fearful. They're not really thinking something's really going to happen, because this is what we live with. I mean, I don't remember, about a month ago, 3 weeks ago, there was wildfire here, and it wasn't close, but it was enough to make the air smoky, and everybody knew there was a wildfire just by the smoke in the air, and everyone got off their phones and went on the Watch Duty app and was like, where is it? How close is it? How bad is it? And that's just kind of what they are too, but at the same time, they're dealing with bigger issues. And so I kind of wanted it in the background, this slowly approaching menace that they were not aware of, to increase the dread and also increase the stakes, because, there is this secret that they're trying to uncover, another missing girl, and all of that could be threatened by this natural disaster. So, and if I'm being honest, this isn't maybe the right word to use, but they were also really fun to write. Not because, wildfires are fun. They're definitely not. But just being able to explore and learn about something that I didn't know that much about, except for as an observer. So learning to me is always just such an important part of the process. Like my poisons with Before She Finds Me, I like exploring areas that I don't know much about.
Yeah, that's really cool. I know you just mentioned a couple things, that it almost was on an island.
Yeah.
So that's kind of crazy to think about. I hope you're enjoying this episode of Book Wild. And if you are, could I ask you a favor? Could you go and rate and review this podcast on whatever platform you're listening? Ratings and reviews make the biggest difference in discoverability of the podcast, and I definitely want to find all of our fellow thriller readers out there. So if you could go rate the podcast and leave a short review, that would make a huge difference. Thank you, and let's get back to the show. With your author's note, you kind of mentioned that like you did have to evacuate, and that feeling made you think like someday I want to write a book that has a wildfire in it, but you didn't necessarily know whose story was going to take place there. So what was it that made you feel like these characters and their story was the right story to pair with this like wildfire?
I think for me, the wildfire actually happened when I was drafting No Bad Deed. I'd actually been through several drafts. It was about a year before I got my book deal that the wildfire happened, October 2017. And there were spots in No Bad Deed that were devastated by the fire. But it felt too soon. And it felt like it just wasn't, I didn't want to layer it in as an afterthought. I do mention places that are burned, before it burned, stuff like that. But it wasn't a wildfire book. It felt like, and it was too soon. It was just too soon. But I knew that I wanted to write something someday, and it was about finding the right moment. I talk about how writing for me is very cathartic, and I work through things. And so What Will Burn Last, I was like, yeah, it's okay. I'm distant enough, but it's still important enough in my brain. It was at the forefront still. And I really want to write this. So I knew I wanted to have, like I said, an isolating, isolation. I knew I wanted there to be isolation, but it wasn't. And then the island, like I said, was the first one. But having never been to an island, and I was actually talking through the idea with my editor, and it was kind of like, oh, we were just talking in general about wildfire. And it was suddenly like, wait, what if that, instead of a physical like island separation, what if instead it was a circumstance, a natural disaster, something else that was more urgent, that was, what was the greater threat to them? And so I kind of backed into it that way. But then once I decided that, then everything else kind of fell into place. It was kind of like, I knew I wanted there to be some kind of, something that was kind of pressuring them, but I just didn't know what it was. And then when the wildfire was like, okay, now I know the whole story. And so it was one of those kind of backwards moments where the setting and that part of it came and solidified the plot. Usually I have the plot and I kind of figure out, okay, where should this take place? This was kind of like, oh no, this is what I want to write. And the whole story changed with it. I mean, it was a hostage drama. It was like a totally different book before. And it was I'm very happy with how it turned out. And that epiphany, like I said, they're inconvenient, but luckily this happened at the beginning of the process.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy because when I was reading this, I was like really close to the end of it, and we went and saw Twisters, which is obviously another thing where it's like a natural disaster is a big part of the antagonist. But what the movie does is it also uses it it specifically uses it as a way of like the characters facing their fears. And so that's kind of it uses a natural disaster, something that's like totally out of our control, as a way for the characters to, like I was saying, like face fears and stuff that's out of their control as well. And I feel like with What Will Burn Last, it kind of like mirrored the fact that like all of these secrets were eventually going to like come through and just kind of not destroy the lives, but there's like it was inevitable at that time in their lives that like the secrets could be kept anymore, basically. So for me, at least, even when I was like watching the movie and like thinking about, oh, I'm reading a book about like a natural disaster too, I think it's kind of cool the way it mirrors what's happening like internally for the characters as well.
Oh, it definitely forces their hand. They've been like Meredith and Leyna have been estranged. They don't really communicate, and Olivia's definitely, like I said, she is not happy to see Leyna back in the neighborhood at all, especially because her surviving son Dominic is also Leyna's former boyfriend crush. And so there's a lot of relationships that are kind of being forced to confront one another.
Yeah. The other thing that is included that makes it super complicated, like there's just so many complicated relationships, but Dominic, Adam's brother, is the one who reaches out to Leyna to kind of have her come back because of this appearance of this girl who looks like Grace. And so they have a lot of history. She kind of always had a crush on him, and then they did actually date for a little while and it didn't work out. But it's another thing that like raises the tension, is that like they are attracted to each other, they enjoy being with each other, but this like big divide in their family because Leyna has opinions about his brother is I know, I'm trying to talk around it. It really added to the tension as well. Did you know that you wanted to like have this kind of will they won't they romance in it as well, or did that like develop as you started writing Leyna?
I enjoy writing a good romantic subplot. You know, it's tricky in a book about, you know, such dark issues. But I do enjoy exploring that. Like No Bad Deed, one of my favorite scenes to write was the early scene with her and her husband. So I really do like exploring those. But I also really enjoyed in this instance having that not Romeo and Juliet vibe, but there is a certain like it is not going to work for them to be together, and they recognize that. And you're right, she has strong opinions about Adam. And Dominic, you know, of course, was the older brother. He was the older brother, the protective brother. He really, of course, Adam is his heart, and a part of his heart, but he also has a spot in his heart for Leyna. So having this kind of somewhat doomed, is it, won't it, you know, will it, they, won't they kind of thing going on. It was one of the fun things to explore. I hate keeping you keep using the word fun, but it is fun to make these relationships, test these relationships and see how far they will go.
Yeah, it makes it, as a reader too, you're just so torn. You're like, especially because you can kind of feel everyone's feelings and why they have these certain feelings. So you're kind of just like, oh man, like I understand Leyna's perspective. We're not in Dominic's perspective, but you understand his as well. But to continue our use of the word fun, because I was going to ask the same thing, was there a POV that you had the most fun writing, or was it just kind of all of them?
It was all of them. I loved the freedom of Merida's point of view, that she doesn't care. She doesn't, I mean, she does, but she doesn't, you'll see. But she was fun in the respect that she could say what she wanted to say and think what she wanted to think. And there were fewer censors. And I mean, the fire was fun just because I learned new things. It was, they took the most time, but they were also the most rewarding for me in a lot of ways. Leyna I liked because I liked exploring the tension between her and Dominic, her and her mom, her and Olivia, and her and herself. I think that was probably the most interesting relationship for me to mine, was her, like you said, being stuck. She is stuck. And part of the reason, other than the fact that she has these strong opinions about Adam, that Dominic and her didn't work, is she didn't really want to be happy. I mean, she feels this guilt about what happened that night, and her quote part in it, which you'll find out about if you read the book. But so she's living with this, sense of loss, a sense of guilt, and why, she's like, how can I just let Grace go and let this go and be happy when it doesn't feel like I'm properly honoring my sister. I'm doing right by her. So she was a lot of fun to write because I would say she was probably my favorite, just because you do spend more time in her head, and she's also at the center of it. She is at the center of it, and it's not easy being in the middle. Having been there myself in life at times, it's not being at the middle of something when there are other pressures on the outside. It's kind of an awkward, uncomfortable place to be. So I liked exploring that with her. But some of the fire scenes were really fun. I liked them.
It was cool reading them, because it was like I was even learning, like to your point that you were learning for them. To write them. It was similarly, I was like, oh, that's how that starts. And I hadn't thought of like sap in trees being super flammable until I was reading these chapters, and I was like, well, and also almost back to Twisters, I live in Indiana, so it's also like not a natural disaster that I have ever had to like prepare for or think about. It's more tornadoes is the only thing. So I thought it was cool, and it just made it super cinematic and even more fun. There were just so many stakes for like each character, and then there's the stakes of like they can't do anything about a wildfire coming toward them.
Yeah, I forgot about tornadoes. I used to spend my summers with my grandparents in Kansas, and so I had my fair share of tornado warnings and hiding out in the basement. And so maybe that in the background is also influencing my desire to work through all these natural disaster issues.
Right.
Next time it'll be an earthquake.
Right. We'll have to see which one you do next. Well, I loved it. I have been talking for a while now about how pacing is what I love about thrillers, and I loved how fast-paced this one is. So for anyone who is looking for a really fast-paced, very summary read, I feel like this is a great one. But I've also been asking people at the end if they've read anything recently that they've loved. And if you haven't, that's okay too.
I prepared for this question. My mind goes blank, which is the thing that always happens, right? Yeah. I mean, I think of books that I've read a couple books back, like California Bear. Loved that.
Okay.
I loved, I was fortunate enough to blurb Megan Collins' next book, and loved that.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to give anything away
cool.
but there was a point in there that made me just like say gasp and say like, shut up, Megan, that's not, and like you fooled me. And I went to the back and read the stuff leading up to it, and I'm like, oh, you totally got me. You totally laid the groundwork and you got me. So that one was a good one. I loved In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead.
Oh yes.
And yeah, so I mean, I've been yeah. Oh, and False Witness by Karen Slaughter. I just finished that one too. So that
Ooh, I haven't read that one yet, but I have heard good things. I mean, she's so great.
She's so great, and I love. She does complicated sister relationships like nobody else. Mm-hmm. I love that dynamic. I mean, I kind of explored it in Blood Will Tell, but I love having had a complicated relationship with my own sister. I love reading about this, and she does such a great job of fully realizing these complicated, flawed characters and their humanity and their choices, good and bad. And I remember talking among my author friends, like, what makes a quote strong woman? What is that dynamic? And it's just all about agency, that even if they are making the wrong choices, they're making it because of their own worldview. They're making it because of who they are and their life experiences. So nobody does that better than her.
Yeah, I love that example, because that's typically my complaint with a character, is if they don't have agency. So I love that perspective, that really that is what makes a strong female. I definitely agree with that. Where can people follow you to stay up to date with it? All of your natural disasters that might show up.
I am Heather Chavez, author, on Instagram. I believe it's the same for Threads. I'm not as active. I'm more of a lurker on Threads, but I'm there. And then I have a Facebook author page as well. I would say definitely the most active on Instagram. And I have a website.
Cool.
heatherchavez.com.
Yes. Nice. Well, I will put all those links in the show notes so that everyone can find that. And thank you so much for talking with me about What Will Burn Last.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was fun.